Hello, it's Papa Mark reading 4 Hoboken stories. Today we're on chapter 4. Remember, yesterday Davis stopped by, and what did he have? He had a moron's delight. Remember that? And he told them that their dog is not a champion, but they didn't believe him. So anyways, right now we're in chapter 4, which starts out. Naturally, we use a lot of milk at the Magic Moscow. The guy who sells us milk is a friend of Steve's. His name is Bruce, and he's an interesting person. The most interesting thing about Bruce is Cheryl, his horse. Bruce says she's the last horse in Hoboken. Cheryl pulls it, of course. Cheryl is the only horse I know. She's a real old horse. She's white and pink with pink around her wrinkled old nose and watery brown eyes. Bruce is always talking about what a smart horse Cheryl is. I never saw her do anything to show that she's smart. I mean, she's a nice horse, and I always wanted to go outside when Bruce delivered the milk and feed Cheryl some stale bread. And she'd sort of snort and nuzzle me, but that doesn't go to show any special intelligence. Usually when Bruce would come by with the milk, he'd sit around the Magic Moscow, having a bowl of soup and telling Steve how smart his horse is. He said that Cheryl had correctly predicted the outcome of the last 5 presidential elections. I never heard her say a word. When Edward came to live at Magic Moscow, Edward's the dog, remember, the conversations between Steve and Bruce changed. Bruce would still brag about how smart his horse was, but now Steve had an animal to brag about. He'd tell Bruce how smart Edward was. He'd also talk about Edward's famous grandfather, Champion Golden Tooth Gorilla, the dog who played Sergeant Schwartz's dog on Sergeant Schwartz of Yukon's dog on television. Meanwhile, Edward, the dog, fell in love with Cheryl, the horse. He thought she was the most wonderful thing he'd ever seen. The first time Bruce and Cheryl came by, after we'd just brought Edward to the Magic Moscow, Edward went crazy. He whined and barked and jumped up and down at the window. We took Edward outside and introduced him to the horse. He licked Cheryl's nose, and she nuzzled him and made little grunting noises. After that, Cheryl would whinny for Edward. Edward would bark and whine and howl until we let him out. Then he'd cavort on the sidewalk, giving Cheryl kisses on the nose, and Cheryl would reach down and bump Edward lovingly. Sometimes we'd let Edward go off with Bruce and Cheryl. He'd ride in the milk wagon, smiling and wagging his tail and barking. Not far from the Magic Moscow is a park where Steve and I would take Edward for exercise. One day there was a sign posted in the park saying that the Hoboken Sled Dog Club was going to have its annual show in that very park on the following Saturday. We decided we'd enter Edward just for fun. We didn't know it, but early in the morning on that following Saturday, John Crisco got up extra early. He'd fed all the dogs at Gold Rush Kennels in Nutley, New Jersey, and then he'd coaxed Prince Razorback out from under the sink by offering him Hershey bars. John Crisco put an extra lot of oily stuff on his hair and squirted himself and Prince Razorback of muck all over with aftershave lotion. John Crisco also put on his special lucky shirt he had brought back from Florida and touched up Prince Razorback's fur here and there with a fountain pen. This is a little bit longer chapter. John Crisco coaxed Prince Razorback and Muckaluck into the back seat of his car, again by offering him Hershey bars. Then, wearing his special lucky shirt, his sunglasses, and his white tennis shoes, John Crisco started out for the Hoboken Sled Club's annual show. When Steve and I arrived with Edward, the park was full of Malamutes. There were big ones and small ones, tall ones and short ones, black and white ones, gray ones, red ones, brown ones, tough ones, silly ones. There were dozens and dozens of Malamutes, with pink tongues flapping, tails wagging, barking and growling and whining, squeaking and mumbling. Malamutes like other Malamutes better than anything. They like to play with each other, show off for each other, and pick fights with each other. Edward had never seen so many Malamutes since his days at the Gold Rush Kennels of Nutley, New Jersey. He just stood there for a while, figuring it out. Then he began to wag his tail. I don't think he ever sees anybody that he wants to fight with, I said. I'm sure Edward will behave, Steve said. I'll go and enter him in the dog show now. I'm going to walk around, I said. Then I'll catch up with you later. There were rings, like boxing rings, set up for the dogs to be shown in. There were tables and silver cups and little statues and prizes that would go to the winners. Next to that, there was a table where people, wearing ribbons that said official, were writing down the names of the dogs that were entered in the show. Steve told them to write down Platinum Blazing Yukon Flash, and then they gave him a cardboard number to wear on his arm. Go to ring number 3 and wait for your numbers to be called, one of the officials told Steve. John Crisco arrived with Prince Razorback of Muckamuck. He had a hard time persuading Prince Razorback to get out of the car. After eating 6 Hershey bars, Prince Razorback finally decided to get out and go with John Crisco to the tables where the officials were taking down names. All the way from the car to the official tables, Prince Razorback made a low, growling noise in his throat and looked from side to side as people and the dogs got out of his way. Go to ring number 3 and wait for your number to be called, the official told John Crisco. John Crisco and Prince Razorback went to ring number 3, where Steve and Edward were also waiting. So I shouldn't have looked up that time. where Steve and Edward were also waiting. John Crisco had forgotten Steve and Edward, and Steve was waving to me on the other side of the ring, so he didn't see John Crisco. But apparently Edward remembered John Crisco, and he especially remembered Prince Razorback of Muckamuck. Edward also remembered that he was a big dog now, and he remembered all the practice he had trying to chomp dogs around Hoboken. Edward lunged forward, pulling his leash out of Steve's hands. He ran at Prince Razorback and chomped him on the nose, hard. Prince Razorback had never been chomped in his whole life. He was so big that dogs had always been afraid of him. He had done all the chomping. Prince Razorback wasn't exactly scared, but he was so surprised that he did a backward somersault and started running. Edward ran after him, growling and screaming. When Prince Razorback started to run, he broke the heavy chain that was attached to his collar, and John Crisco fell over backwards on top of Steve, who was just turning around to see what had happened. John Crisco and Steve struggled to their feet and began running after the dogs, shouting at them to come back. Edward chased Prince Razorback all around the park. When some of the dogs saw Prince Razorback running straight at them, they got scared, broke away, and started running from him. Some of the other dogs saw Prince Razorback and Edward run past them and broke away and started running after them. The dogs' owners ran after them, shouting to them to come back. There were soon 122 dogs, including Prince Razorback and Edward, running as fast as they could around the park. 60 dogs running away from Prince Razorback. 61 dogs, including Edward, running after him. And there was 122 owners, including John Crisco and Steve, running after them. Prince Razorback was not very bright. He didn't have many ideas, but as he was running, he started to have one. Why Prince Razorback run from all these stupid little dogs, he thought. Because Prince Razorback chased them. Prince Razorback of Muckamuck stopped and turned around. He made an awful face and ran at the dogs who had been running after him. All of the dogs screamed and started running the other way, all except Edward, who stood still and got ready to fight. But Prince Razorback had forgotten all about Edward's chomping him on the nose. He was interested in chasing the 61 dogs who had been chasing him. He chased right into Edward and ran over him. When 122 owners saw all of the dogs running towards them, they started waving their arms and shouting, "Here, girl! Come, boy!" They tried to catch their dogs, but the dogs slipped past them. The dogs who had not been running around after Prince Razorback stopped when they noticed that no one was chasing after them anymore. Then they saw all the dogs running in the opposite direction away from Prince Razorback, and they started running after them. They ran right over Edward, who was just getting over being knocked over by Prince Razorback. There was a little lake in the park, and Prince Razorback chased the dogs who were running away from him right into the lake. Then he jumped in after them. Once they were in the water, the dogs forgot about chasing and being chased. Even Prince Razorback calmed down and floated on his back, waving his paws in the air. All the owners lined up on the edge of the little lake and shouted to the dogs to come back. Then the other bunch of dogs, the ones who had been running away from Prince Razorback and then turned around, arrived at the edge of the lake, going fast. They bumped into the crowd of owners and knocked most of them into the water. Then the dogs jumped in too. I found Edward, walking in circles, shaking his head to get away after being knocked down twice and run over by 121 Malamutes. Steve came along, dripping, and picked up Edward's leash and led him back to ring number 3, where the judges were waiting. In the lake, the owners were splashing around, trying to catch their dogs and drag them up the muddy, slippery bank. Edward won the blue ribbon, also a red ribbon, a yellow ribbon, and a white ribbon. He won six silver cups too, because every other dog was soaking wet, covered with mud, or still swimming in the lake. It was late afternoon when we took Edward back to the Magic Moscow, along with the blue, red, and yellow and white ribbons and the 6 silver cups. Most of the other dogs had been caught and taken home. Some of the owners were drying off their dogs with towels. John Crisco was tired after all the running and swimming, and he and Prince Razorback were floating on their backs, eating some Hershey bars that John Crisco had in his pockets. "I think Edward did very well for his first time," Steve said. "Me too," I said. "I'm sure he would have won even if all the other dogs hadn't jumped in the lake." Steve arranged all of Edward's trophies and ribbons over the counter at the Magic Moscow. He made Edward a moron's delight to celebrate his winning. When customers come to the Black Magic Moscow, they ask Steve, "Did your dog win all those ribbons and trophies?" "Of course he did," Steve said. "He's a very important dog. He's the grandson of champion Golden-Toothed Gorilla, the dog that played Hercules Sergeant Schwartz of the Yukon's dog. His name is Platinum Blazing Yukon Flash." But we all call him Edward.